Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to read some Hegel. We're going to read Robert Stern's commentary on the master-slave dialectic. So, the book that we're reading from is Robert Stern's Routledge Guidebook to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. In a previous video, I did the transition from consciousness to self-consciousness. So here we're going to do the master and slave, or lordship and bondage. With the breakdown of consciousness and the collapse of its purely object-centered theoretical attitude, we now move to self-consciousness, which takes up the opposing stance by placing the subject at the center of things. As one might expect, Hegel wants to show that both attitudes are one-sided. Put simply, consciousness was one-sided because it tried to displace itself from the world and take up a purely objective stance, while self-consciousness is one-sided because it tries to impose itself on the world too strongly, so the self-world distinction collapses, and the self-consciousness is reduced to the motionless tautology of I am I. Hegel sets out the modern problem here quite clearly. Discussion of self-consciousness in the third part of the encyclopedia, the Philosophy of Spirit. Quote, in consciousness we see the tremendous difference on the one side of the I, this wholly simple existence, and on the other side of the infinite variety of the world. It is this opposition of the I and the world which has not yet reached a genuine mediation that constitutes the finitude of consciousness. Self-consciousness, on the other hand, has its finitude in its still quite abstract self-identity. What is present in the I equals I of immediate self-consciousness is a difference that merely ought to be, not yet a posited or actual difference. As with his previous discussion of consciousness, Hegel attempts to bring out the one-sidedness of self-consciousness by showing that it cannot properly resolve the dialectic of universal and individual, not this time in relation to the object, but in relation to itself as subject, and the conception it has of its own identity. Having introduced the turn from consciousness to self-consciousness, Hegel feels able to move from the arid forms of shapeless generalities of the theoretical attitude, which concluded his discussion of consciousness, to a conception of nature that is once again noisy with life. Thus, the self-consciousness begins by interacting with the world at the level of desire, as a practical rather than a theoretical attitude. It finds the dull northern fog has lifted to reveal a world teeming with living things. But for us, or in itself, the object, which for self-consciousness is the negative element, has on its side returned into itself, just as on the other side consciousness has done. Through this reflection into itself, the object has become life. What self-consciousness distinguishes from itself as having being also has in it, insofar as it is posited as being, not merely the character of sense certainty and perception, but it is being that is reflected into itself and the object of immediate desire as a living thing. Hegel goes on to suggest that self-consciousness cannot be certain by itself, by simply identifying itself with this world of living things, for in that world there appears to be too little room for any notion of individuality. What matters at the level of life is the genus, not the particular individual. So that at this level, the I as a particular individual does not count for much. Self-consciousness therefore conceives of itself as merely an animal consciousness. Once the subject has moved to the level of focusing on itself qua individual, so this has itself as a pure I for object. Hegel now sets out to show that it is no more possible for the subject to find satisfaction in its practical relation to the world if it tries to do so immediately than it was for it to find satisfaction in its theoretical relation to the world through the simplistic model of sense certainty. At its most basic, this practical relation takes the form of desire, in which the subject exerts itself as a kind of pure will, where any sense of estrangement from the world is countered by the destruction of the object, and so by a negation of its otherness in a literal sense. Certain of the nothingness of its other, it explicitly affirms that this nothingness is for it the truth of the other. It destroys the independent object, and thereby gives itself the certainty of itself as a true certainty, a certainty which has become explicit for self-consciousness itself in an objective manner. Thus, with the desire, the subject attempts to preserve its individuality by negating the world around it. The difficulty with the desire, however, is that it involves the destruction of the object. Once this object is destroyed, the subject has nothing over which to exert its control and demonstrate its individuality. The subject must therefore find itself another object to destroy, so the process can begin again, leading to an obviously empty regress. Desire and the self-certainty obtained in its gratification are contained by the object, for sense certainty comes from superseding this other. In order that this supersession can take place, there must be this other. This self-consciousness, by its negative relation to the object, is thus unable to supersede it. It is really because of that relation that it produces the object again, and the desire as well. At this point, Hegel offers one of his characteristic previews, where he tells us how ultimately the difficulty faced by desire will be resolved. This will happen when the single self-consciousness sees the world as containing other self-consciousnesses. For in seeing that others are selves like it, and in thereby recognizing itself in them, the subject is no longer faced by sheer otherness, where only by negating the world can the subject find itself in it. As Hegel makes clear, when self-consciousness subject is able to see itself in the other, we will have arrived at a decisive turning point in the journey of consciousness through the phenomenology, after which consciousness will be capable of much more balanced outlook than has achieved hitherto. A self-consciousness in being an object is just as much I as object. With this, we already have before us the notion of spirit. What still lies ahead for consciousness is the experience of what spirit is, this absolute substance, which is the unity of the different independent self-consciousnesses, which, in their opposition, enjoy perfect freedom and independence, the I that is we, and the we that is I. It is in self-consciousness, in the notion of spirit, that consciousness first finds its turning point, where it leaves behind it the colourful show of the sensuous here and now, sense certainty and perception, and the night-like void of the supersensible beyond, force and the understanding, and steps out into the spiritual daylight of the present. At the beginning of the section that follows this passage, entitled Independence and Dependence of Self-Consciousness, Mastery and Servitude, Hegel continues with his preview, spelling out what this mutual recognition involves. Essentially, each consciousness must acknowledge the other as an autonomous subject, as something that has an independent existence of its own, which therefore it cannot utilize for its own purposes, if that object does not, of its own accord, do what the first does to it. The Kantian echoes of treating people as ends in themselves rather merely as means is unmistakable. Moreover, each self-consciousness must also realize and accept that its well-being and identity as a subject is bound up with how it is seen by the other self-consciousness, which is where Hegelian recognition differs from Kantian respect. If this recognition is reciprocal, Hegel argues that neither side need fear that acknowledging the other and feeling itself bound to it in a relationship like love, for example, it has lost itself. Each sees the other do the same as it does. Each does itself what it demands of the other, and therefore also does what it does only insofar as the other does the same. Action by one side only would be useless because what is to happen can only be brought about by both. So for further discussion, see Honneth, Sipp, and Williams. Life and death struggle. Hegel makes clear, however, that with this outline account of fully developed recognition, he is anticipating what is still to come, commenting that we have now to see how the process of this pure notion of recognition, of the duplicating of self-consciousness in its oneness, appears to self-consciousness. At first, it will exhibit the side of the inequality of the two, or the splitting up of the middle term into the extremes, which as extremes are opposed to one another, one being only recognized, the other only recognizing. Thus, at the stage we have reached, the single self-consciousness is not yet able to achieve a stable sense of its own identity in the face of the other self-consciousness. As he puts the problem elsewhere, quote, "In this determination lies the tremendous contradiction that, on the one hand, the I is wholly universal, absolutely pervasive, and interrupted by no limit, is the universal essence common to all men. The two mutually related selves, therefore, constituting one identity, constituting, so to speak, one light, and yet, on the other hand, they are also two selves rigidly and unyieldingly confronting each other, each existing as a reflection into itself, as absolutely distinct from and impenetrable by the other. Thus, we once again have a tension between universality, the wholly universal I belonging to both self-consciousness and individuality, the sense that each self-consciousness has of itself as an individual fundamentally distinct from the other self-consciousness." Hegel's attempt to bring out the difficulty this creates for self-consciousness in achieving a stable self-identity is one of the most well-known and influential sections of the phenomenology. Unfortunately, however, it is open to conflicting interpretations. For although it is clear that the dialectic takes us from desire through life and death struggle to mastership and servitude, it is not so obvious exactly what argument is meant to underpin the transition from desire to the life and death struggle. On the simplest interpretation, the argument is as follows. As we have seen, the difficulty with desire is that the subject faces a continual progression as the destruction of the object leads to the re-emergence of desire. The subject then turns from objects to other subjects in order to resolve this difficulty, for other subjects do not need to be destroyed in order to be made subservient to the will, so they can be assimilated without leading to the contradiction of desire. On account of the independence of the object, therefore, self-consciousness can achieve satisfaction only when the object itself effects the negation within itself. Since the object is in its own self-negation, and in being so is at the same time independent, it is consciousness. Thus, self-consciousness achieves its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. However, as I try to impose my will on you, so you will try to impose your will on me. We will then end up in a conflict, the life and death struggle, which is only resolved when one of us concede defeat and succumbs to the will of the other, hence becoming a slave while the victor becomes a master. As an argument, this has a certain plausibility, but it seems that Hegel had something more sophisticated in mind, as it leaves out an important aspect of the text. It leaves out the significance of recognition as the source of the struggle. Rather than desire, that is, it appears that it is not because I am trying to make you subject to my will that we end up fighting, but because I am seeking to secure recognition from you, where this means that I want you to see me as another subject, for which turning you into a vehicle for my desire is either a necessary nor sufficient condition. On this reading, recognition replaces desire as the outlook for self-consciousness, because it has realized that desire is contradictory. It hopes to find in recognition a form of practical well-being that is more realizable. Thus, when Hegel says that, quote, self-consciousness exists in and for itself when, and by the fact that it so exists for another, that is, it exists only by being acknowledged, he is here taken to be introducing a new step in the dialectic, where recognition rather than the imposition of will through desire has become the goal of consciousness. Even if this reading is accepted, however, there is still room for debate over how the life and death struggle between different subjects is to be understood. On one view, the explanation is comparable to the explanation we gave above on the desire account. Namely, while I want you to recognize me, I do not want to recognize you, as this seems to threaten my individuality and or freedom, so we are inevitably led into a battle for recognition each tries to wrest recognition from the other while giving nothing in return. Excuse me. Eventually, this battle is won by one subject or the other, who then serves as master to the other as slaves. As we have seen, Hegel emphasizes this lack of mutual recognition at the outset. Quote, at first, recognition will exhibit the side of the inequality of the two, or the splitting up of the middle term into the extremes, which, as extremes, are opposed to one another, one being only recognized, the other only recognizing. However, while, again, this argument has a certain plausibility, on another line of interpretation, it appears defective as a reading of the text because it misses out on certain other important aspects of Hegel's discussion, which is the significance he gives to the fact that in the life and death struggle, individuals show themselves as willing to forfeit their lives. The contrast may be put as follows. On the previous reading, risking one's life is merely a side effect, as it were, of the lack of mutual recognition, where this leads to a struggle in which life is imperiled, while on the reading we are now considering, risking one's life is the reason for the struggle itself. How can this be? On this reading, the answer is that in order to achieve recognition, I must show you that I am a subject and not a mere living thing. But although each of us knows that we are subjects, we need to convince the other that we are, for otherwise we may be seen as merely living creatures lacking a subjecthood, and so fail to be granted the recognition we require. As Sartre puts it, to the extent that the other apprehends me as bound to a body and immersed in life, I am only another. In order to make myself recognized by the other, I must risk my own life. To risk one's life, in fact, is to reel oneself as not bound to the objective form or to any determinate existence, as not bound to life. Thus, on this reading, the requirement on each subject to risk its life is the reason for the life and death struggle, rather than the lack of mutual recognition, as each tries to show the other that it is not a mere living creature. Now, textual support for this interpretation can be found in the following passage. Quote, one individual is confronted by another individual. Appearing thus immediately on the scene, they are, for one another, like ordinary objects, independent shapes, individuals submerged in the being or immediacy of life. For the object of its immediacy is here determined as life. They are for each other shapes of consciousness, which have not yet accomplished the movement of absolute abstraction of rooting out all immediate being, and of being merely the purely negative being of self-identical of consciousness. In other words, they have not as yet exposed themselves to each other in the form of pure being for self or as self-consciousness. Here Hegel appears to be claiming that the most basic way for a subject to demonstrate its status as a subject to another, and hence to achieve recognition for its subjecthood, is to show that it is prepared to sacrifice its existence as an object. That is, to show that it is prepared to give up its life. So let's just see. So we're on page 113, and we go to page 119. Okay, so we've got a few more pages to go. So, here Hegel appears to be claiming that the most basic way for a subject to demonstrate its status to a subject to another, and hence to achieve recognition for its subjecthood, is to show that it is prepared to sacrifice its existence as an object, that is, to show that it is prepared to give up its life. The presentation of itself, however, is the pure abstraction of self-consciousness, consists in showing itself as a pure negation of its objective mode, or in showing that it is not attached to any specific existence, not to the individuality common to existence as such, that it is not attached to life. Thus, the relation of the two consciousness individuals is such that they prove themselves and to each other through a life and death struggle. They must engage in this struggle, for they must raise their certainty of being for themselves to truth, both in the case of their other and in their own case. And it is only through staking one's life that freedom is won, and that it is proved that for self-consciousness, its essential being is not just being, not the immediate form in which it appears, not its submergence in the expanse of life, but rather that there is nothing present in it which could not be regarded as a vanishing moment, that it is only pure being for self. For Hegel, it appears, a creature that shows it has knowingly and willingly risked its destruction as a living thing, thereby differentiates itself from mere animal life and shows itself to be human. As he puts it in the Philosophy of Right, quote, I have these limbs, and my life only in so far as I will it. The animal cannot mutilate or destroy itself, but the human being can. Quote, every determinacy by which the single being should be gripped, he can cut away from himself, and in that he can realize his absolute independence and freedom for himself as absolutely negative consciousness. However, while the reading we are now considering has an advantage over the others in doing justice to these aspects of the text, it has the disadvantage of making the argument open to an obvious objection, namely, if what is required here for recognition of my subjecthood is that I risk my life, why do I have to fight you? Why couldn't I show lack of concern for my biological nature and ends by risking my life in front of you in a non-conflictual way, by jumping off a cliff or fighting with an animal or enlisting a good cause? Even if it is right that I must risk my life at this stage, why should I do so through attempting to kill you? Now, an obvious answer might be to say that while I am driven to try to risk my life to show myself to be a subject in your eyes, I am driven to fight you because I still want you to recognize me without giving any recognition in return. Thus, risking my life in fighting you gives me a good way of achieving both my goals at once. This, however, may seem a rather ad hoc way of bridging these two facets of life and death struggle. It also does not seem to fit the text very well, for Hegel seems to offer a different answer to the question of why I come to risk my life through the life and death struggle. The relevant passage is as follows. The individual who has not risked his life may well be recognized as a person, but he has not attained to the truth of this recognition as the independent self-consciousness. Similarly, just as each stakes his own life, so each must seek the other's death, for it values the other no more than itself. Its essential being is present to it in the form of another. It is outside of itself and must rid itself of its externality. The other is an immediate consciousness entangled in a variety of relationships, and it must regard its otherness as a pure being for self, or as an absolute negation. One interpretation of this passage might be this, based on the thought that the life riskers value the other no more than itself. I have no regard for myself, qua a natural subject, so I have no regard for you, qua a natural subject. So I have no regard for you, qua natural subject, and I find no reason not to kill you, insofar as life is merely part of your being as a natural subject. However, while this interpretation might explain why I could be prepared to kill you, it does not explain why I should feel compelled to do so. So another interpretation might be this. I only expect recognition from you insofar as I show myself to be more than an animal subject. Likewise, I only recognize you if you show yourself to be the same. So I will not recognize you without testing you to see if you are worthy of recognition. And the way to do this is to put your life in peril and see how you behave. Quote, the ego must accordingly set itself to find proof. It must test the alter ego to adjudicate the presence of freedom. And this test will involve the negation, disregard, and destruction of life. This then explains why subjects must fight each other. Each is prepared to stake its life while each sets out to test the other. So each will attack the other while each is responding by risking his life. Put in schematic terms, we have identified three different accounts of the transition from desire to life and the death struggle. We have A, we start with desire, impose will on objects, impose will on subjects. Each tries to impose will on the other, life and death struggle between subjects. Then we have B, desire, impose will on objects, move from desire to one-sided recognition, life and death struggle, as one subject seeks to get recognition from another without giving anything in return. And C, desire, impose will on objects, move from desire to recognition. Recognition by other requires staking life, and recognition of other requires testing other from willingness to stake life and death struggle. As well as having different structures, these accounts also have a rather different implications for regarding the limitations of self-consciousness that Hegel is trying to highlight at this stage, which lead it into the life and death struggle. Under interpretation A, self-consciousness is limited because it treats subjects as it treated objects and so tries to negate them. Under interpretation B, self-consciousness is limited by the fact that it is unable to grant recognition to other subjects without feeling that its own autonomy is undermined. And under interpretation C, self-consciousness is limited because it finds it can only show itself to be a self by risking its life, because at this stage, in the emergence of the self, it lacks any other resources for doing so. In a primitive situation, the only way I can demonstrate my independence from my animal being is show that it is nothing to me. I must risk my life in the eyes of the other, Bernstein. And this is where Hegel himself says that the struggle for recognition, quote, can only occur in the natural state where men exist only as a single separate individuals. Whereas in society proper, individuals can show themselves to be worthy of this recognition by showing themselves to be rational subjects by obeying the law, filling a post, following a trade, or other kind of social activity. If we, however, adopt interpretation C as fitting the text more completely than other options, we have considered there is nonetheless something rather unsatisfactory about this interpretation's line on the grounds of the difficulties faced by self-consciousness at this stage, namely that the social order is too limited to allow recognition to occur without the risk of life. For up until now, the dialectic has been driven by some sort of conceptual one-sidedness or tension, but under interpretation C, it is driven by the fact that self-consciousness is operating in a primitive situation, which would seem to leave no room for the kind of categorical diagnosis we have seen hitherto. Now, it may be for this reason that in later discussion of life and death in the encyclopedia, Hegel seems to revert to something more like interpretation B, where the life and death struggle is said to take place because recognition at this stage is one-sided. That one-sidedness is explained through the limited notion of freedom operative here, namely that if one subject recognizes another as a subject, it takes this to undermine its freedom, and so is unwilling to grant this recognition. It is still the case at this point in the dialectic that in that I recognize other as being free, I lose my freedom. At this present standpoint, we have to forget completely the relationship we are used to thinking about. If we speak of right ethically love, we know that I recognize the other. I recognize their complete personal independence. We know too that I do not suffer on this account, but have validity as a free being. That in that the others have rights, I am free, them I have them too. Or that my right is also essentially that of the other, that I am a free person, and that this is essentially the same as the others also being persons with rights. Benevolence or love does not involve the submergence of my personality. Here, however, there is as yet no such relationships, for one aspect of the determination is that of my still being as a free self-consciousness, an immediate and single one, insofar as the immediate singularity of myself, of my consciousness, and my freedom are not yet separated. I am unable to surrender anything of my particularity without surrendering my free independence. Self-consciousness at this point must resist recognizing another as a free being, just as, on the other hand, each must concern itself with eliciting recognition within the other's self-consciousness being posited as an independent being. The single self is not able to bear the other's being independent of it, so that they necessarily drift into a struggle. Here we have something more like a conceptual limitation bringing about the life and death struggle. For each self-consciousness takes it that recognition of the freedom of the other threatens its own freedom, insofar as it assumes that to be free is to be able to ignore claims made on me by other individuals, and to act exactly as my egotistical desires, my particularity dictate. It is Hegel's aim to show that both these assumptions are mistaken, in a way that consciousness must come to accept if it is to move beyond the impasse that leads to life and death struggle, where Hegel state that what gives rise at this stage to the struggle for recognition and of the relationship of lordship and servitude is the, quote, as yet only immediate consciousness of freedom. So we have now the master of the slave. However, the transition from desire to the life and death struggle is understood. The transition from here to mastership and servitude is more straightforward, as it becomes apparent that there is something deeply unsatisfying about the life and death struggle as a means of achieving recognition in the eyes of the other. For either the subject succeeds in killing the other, in which case there is no other subject to do the recognizing, or the first subject is killed, in which case their selfhood is lost. This trial by death, however, does away with the truth which was supposed to issue from it, and so too with the certainty of self generally. For just as life is the natural setting of consciousness, independence without absolute negativity, so death is the natural negation of consciousness, negation without independence, which thus remains without the required significance of recognition. As soon as this occurs to self-consciousness, it gives up its struggle to appear as a subject in the eyes of the other, and hence its struggle to go free and become a slave. Once one's self-consciousness realizes that life is as essential to it, life and death struggle, once one's self-consciousness realizes that life is essential to it as pure self-consciousness, and so gives up the life and death struggle, it appears at first the two self-consciousnesses can now attain a kind of equilibrium, where the one that has given up the struggle is the slave and the other is the master. The master can now show himself to be a subject in the eyes of the slave, not by risking his life, but by exercising power over the slave's body, the very thing the slave was not prepared to lose in the struggle. At the same time, the master can overcome his estrangement from the world not simply by trying to destroy it, which was the only possibility at the level of desire, but by setting the slave to work on it. However, Hegel quickly sets out to demonstrate that this apparent stability is illusory. He begins by pointing out that although the master has shown himself to be a subject in the eyes of the other, It is not clear how he can view this other any differently from an object, insofar as the slave, like any object, is a mere instrument of his will, and so it is hard for him to maintain that any recognition has been achieved. So although, on the one hand, here is present this moment of recognition, that the slave consciousness sets aside its own being for itself. On the other hand, because what the bondsman does is really the action of the Lord, the outcome is a recognition that is one-sided and unequal. At the same time, Hegel argues that, contrary to initial appearances, it is the slave that will withdraw into itself and be transformed into a truly independent consciousness. The first step, Hegel claims, comes through the experience of fear with which its servitude began. In this, the transitoriness of life was brought home to the slave in a way that the master has not come to feel. So it is the master and not the slave who has the most immediate relationship to his natural existence. Likewise, through his work for the master, the slave is forced to set aside its own desires and thus finds himself no longer driven by them. Most importantly of all, Hegel argues, quote, through work, the bondsman becomes conscious of what he truly is. This is because in creating things not for himself, but for the master, he is forced not just to consume things, but rather to labor on them while leaving them in existence. As a result, he finds that he can leave his mark on the world in a way that is lasting. Through this rediscovery of himself by himself, the bondsman realizes that it is precisely in his work, wherein he seemed to have only an alienated existence, that he acquires a mind of his own. Hegel is particularly insistent that all three of these elements, fear, service, and work, on the world must be present together for this realization to occur, as otherwise each will be degraded. For example, fear will remain inward and mute unless the subject can find himself again through work, while work without the experience of fear will mean it once again become an empty, self-centered attitude. The slave, therefore, comes to a different conception of individuality from that adopted by the master, who has not gone much beyond desire. In particular, the slave no longer sees the world as alien to it, which must therefore be negated if it is to achieve its unalloyed feeling of self. Rather, in his work, the slave labors for someone else's satisfaction and so learns respect for the independent existence of the objects around him, with which he finds he can work. Consciousness thus comes to a new conception of itself as an individual in the world, by now treating that world as a place to which it is unattuned, it is attuned, not merely because it has various skills that make it master over some things, but because it possesses universal formative activity, which gives its own universal power over the whole of objective being. So this is Stern's account of the master-slave dialectic in the Phenomenology. There's a lot in it. And also there's basically an overview of the literature on the section and why certain readings of the text don't fit the text particularly that well. Okay, till next time. Take care.